I do my best to stay unbiased as possible when I'm teaching this material, right? It's not my job to tell you what to think, but just to present these various views. This is one of those cases, though, where I think I need to make my bias pretty clear. The guy we're going to be talking about in this video, Garrett Hardin, was kind of gross. An avowed white nationalist. He's going to be giving some very racist arguments, and they're going to kind of fall apart. The only reason, honestly, that I teach this paper and this author is because I've had in the past, I was doing famine relief stuff, and students would come in having read Hardin stuff from other classes, maybe English class or maybe a history class, I don't know, and it was a significant number of students. And they were like, oh yeah, this paper is great, and not realizing the sort of really, really racist undertones. I mean, I don't even know if they're undertones, but and the kind of really rough arguments that he's going to be making. So I want to take some time and unpack this, but I will, and I promise to steelman the argument as much as I can, and Hardin does make some actual good, legitimate points that we'll take a look at. So let's get into it. So Hardin is going to be on the complete opposite side of Peter Singer. Hardin is going to be arguing that not only are we not obligated to give to developing nations, but that doing so would be, I think if we take his argument at face value, doing so would be immoral. Okay, and so we have to see how that argument might work. And the central point of disagreement between Hardin and Singer is this right here, that whether deaths as a result of famine are bad or not. And Singer says in his paper, and it's pretty early on, he says, I take it that deaths as a result of famine are bad. If you don't agree, you don't need to read my paper anymore. Hardin is one of those people who would not have finished Singer's paper. He thinks that deaths as a result of famine are just sort of consequences of bad policy and a way to keep the global population in check, to stop overpopulation. Now, the thing is, throughout this paper, and you can still, you can find it free online, he's arguing about, giving donations, giving charitable stuff to poor countries. But it just kind of always ends up being the case that the examples that he uses, the countries that he talks about, all seem to involve people that don't look like Hardin. In other words, they are people of color. And that should not go unnoticed. But we are going to try to put as much of this aside as we can and focus on the general points that he's trying to make. There are enough flaws in his argument without, pointing to the overt racism. But what Hardin is going to do is he's going to compare the situation in the developed world, say in the United States, to that of a lifeboat. He's using this because other authors have compared Earth to a spaceship, and he doesn't like that analogy. So he's going to use a lifeboat instead. So here's the scenario. There's 50 of us in a lifeboat. We've got a capacity of 60, so we can fit 10 more people. We see a group of 100 people swimming towards us, and all of them obviously want in. Whom do we save? How do we decide? This is sort of the question he kicks things off with, and there are a lot of really plausible answers. Maybe first come, first serve. Find the people who need it the most, the worst swimmers. Maybe find the people, maybe there's somebody who's really good at navigating, or maybe there's a doctor or something who can contribute to the lifeboat's overall survival. There's lots of ways of figuring out whom we can let on to the lifeboat in a way that's reasonable and fair. Hardin's solution, though, might surprise you. We're not going to let anyone on. Nobody. Those 10 spaces are just extra resources, and giving up those resources puts the entire lifeboat at risk. And if you disagree, you're more than welcome to give up your seat for one of these people, he says. So this comes down to basically an overpopulation argument, right? The more people that you have, the fewer resources that you have to go around. That seems to be how this argument is meaning to go. It's just not going to work. So we're not going to engage in the racist stuff. We're just going to be looking at least for now, we're just going to be looking at what the problem with this is. So this is like a genuine kind of phenomenon. You'll see this in like systems engineering, where you do want to have like excess capacity for certain systems in order to have like a safety threshold. But like, if we were to apply this to nations, I guess the thought here is that if we give up our surplus, we now no longer have, any kind of resources if something goes wrong. Maybe there's a new kind of crop disease or a bad harvest or whatever. So if we're giving up these extra resources and something goes wrong, there's nothing we can really do about it. So we need that little buffer for ourselves. This is a very strange analogy. So first off, it seems to be suggesting that like the only way that we have of helping people is by allowing them to like immigrate. And that doesn't seem to be true at all. We don't have to like let people onto the lifeboat in order to help them necessarily. It also assumes that we would continue producing resources at the same rate, even though our population has gone up. And that doesn't seem to be true either. And it also seems to suggest that it's just not possible to save for an emergency while also donating surplus resources. In other words, what a surplus resource, and we saw this with Peter Singer, surplus doesn't mean like everything that you're not actively using. What it means is like once you have saved for an emergency and for retirement and things like that, then you get to the surplus, right? That's what we're talking about here. So surplus is the stuff that you have left over after saving for an emergency. Now, this is Hardin's argument in terms of math. It is very strange. So he's writing this in the early 70s. At the time, the U.S. population was around 210 million and growing at about 0.8% per year. And what he's going to do is compare that to 7 developing nations, all with a combined population of 210 million, so that the populations are roughly the same. But because those are developing nations, they are growing at a much higher rate, at 3.3% per year, which means they're doubling every 21 years. And so after 87 years, each American, right, would have to share with more than 8 people from each of these other nations because their population would increase that much. So the resources that we're giving now would increase, 8 times as much as over these 87 years. And this is the population argument that he gives. The math as far as it goes is right, but it doesn't go very far. First off, birth rates do not remain constant. As nations develop, population rates or population increase rates, birth rates go down. Why would we assume constant resource contribution? It's just a little bit strange. Like, here's the idea. Hardin is still saying that like, oh, well, for every one, person in the US, there's 8 other people we have to feed. Why isn't it the reverse? That like, hey, for every one person in the US, there's 8 other people we could rely on, right? It's strange to think that like, as these nations continue to grow and develop, they're just going to stay impoverished. Now, this is super, super dumb. I'm sorry to be like so just overtly biased here, but like, he does acknowledge that current population trends are going to change, but he gets it backwards. This is a quote from the paper. Most likely, the rate of population increase will decline much faster in the US than it will in the other countries. And there doesn't seem to be much we can do about it. That is not how that works, right? As nations develop, their population rates decline, or population increases decline, and quite rapidly as they start to develop. So for a proper analogy here, we need like a good analog. And there just isn't one, right? First off, lifeboats. There is an obvious fixed capacity limit. There is not really one for nations. The resources are going to be obviously finite, right? You can't grow new food on a lifeboat. There is going to be obvious and necessary physical risk to everyone on board for a lifeboat, not the case for immigration or helping people in developing nations. You have to like actually give up physical space in order to help people on a lifeboat, whereas that's just not a thing in the real world. And I think importantly, the people in the lifeboat aren't, at least the way that Hardin cashes it out, they aren't responsible. They don't have anything to do with like why these other people are in the water, right? It's a better analogy would be, you know, like we stripped their resources and then flooded their lands, and that's why they're in this lifeboat or in this situation to begin with. So let's try and just sort of get at the core of what Hardin is trying to get at. So this is me doing my best to sort of get Hardin's argument formalized. You know, he's a microbiologist, he's not a philosopher, so he's not going to put arguments in premise conclusion form like this. That we can't hold against him. I mean, non-philosophers are allowed to do philosophy. That's totally fine. So premise one, poorer nations tend to have higher birth rates than developed nations. Okay, that seems true. Deaths due to famine relief help curb population growth. Okay. So donating to famine relief would contribute to overpopulation. This kind of comes from premise 1 and 2. Overpopulation would cause mass suffering. We shouldn't want to contribute to mass suffering, so we should not donate to famine relief. This is Hardin's argument as best as I understand it, and put as cleanly as I can. Here are going to be the issues with it. Again, we've talked about the just kind of overt or barely covert racism. What Hardin ends up doing here, it ends up getting developed into like modern, like contemporary conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement that you'll see white nationalists kind of touting around, and it's just not a thing. But Hardin is a big influence on this. We've got the factual errors that we've talked about, right? Population dynamics, populations don't just grow and grow and grow until they, you know, cover the entire planet. That's not how population growth works, and he's a microbiologist. It seems like you would know that. This is also like what we would be doing. We're not like flying hamburgers out to, you know, starving people. No, like we're probably looking to help build infrastructure. We're probably helping these developing nations to develop, which in turn will help with population rates. So it's just like he just keeps missing the point here. So yeah, these are the main kinds of problems with Hardin's arguments. These are the things that I just wanted to make sure we kind of flagged. But what we can sort of think about here, this is something that Hardin seems to be right about. Now, this is not Hardin's idea, but I'm pretty sure he popularized it, or at least like got it, you know, sort of more out there. This is called the tragedy of the commons. This is a thing that actually does happen. It was somewhere, I want to say in England, where the, like, you know, some nobility in the area or whatever had like land that they weren't using. And so they told the local, you know, like people like, hey, you can come let your cattle graze here, like for free, you know, just like come and have them eat the grass. And if everybody had just sort of cooperated and taken what they needed, they would have been fine. But instead, people like wanted to make sure they got theirs, and everybody kind of rushed the area, and the cows overgrazed, and it just turned into a muddy dirt patch. And so this is the tragedy of the commons. The basic idea is that a common good is not cared for like a private good would be, right? And we do kind of see this. Something that everybody has a right to, has unfettered access to. This is something that can happen. But Hardin is going to try to apply this to the notion of a world food bank to argue that we shouldn't have such a thing. First off, access to a world food bank is very much controlled and is not just completely unfettered. There is, like, for the most part, yes, all the actors are going to be like self-interested, but we would expect others to cooperate within a World Food Bank situation because there are rational reasons to do so. But notice, like, the existence of a common good like a World Food Bank does imply something more than just self-interest, right? And so, again, the guy who's bad at analogies just seems to be bad at analogies. Bottom line, tragedy of the commons, real thing, but just doesn't seem to have a lot of application to, some kind of world food bank. Now, let's kind of get to what he's trying to get at here. So this is, I think this is a quote from him, or no, it's a paraphrase. So nations that fail to budget for emergencies should suffer the consequences and learn from their mistakes. Wealthy nations that repeatedly bail them out are rewarding poor governance and bad resource management, discouraging self-sufficiency. Now, this isn't crazy. This is a pretty reasonable kind of worry that we might have. But it is going to be kind of problematic, as we'll see. Let's just sort of take we're just going to steelman this thing. We're just going to take what Hardin has and just try to make it as strong as we can. That's what a steelman argument is. So here's the idea, is that some kind of moral requirement to donate surplus resources is kind of penalizing resource management, right? In a sense, it might even work to disincentivize saving, right? Because as soon as you get a surplus, you'd be obligated to give that surplus away. Right. And so, as a really strange example of this, it comes in, this is like a trolley problem is, you've got like a runaway car and there's two motorcyclists. One doesn't have a helmet and one does. And like, which one do you hit? If you hit the guy with the helmet, he's a lot more likely to survive. But now it almost feels like he's being punished for having worn a helmet. It's a similar idea here, and it's definitely not a crazy one. The thing about this argument now, where we've ended up, is just completely divorced from whatever Hardin was talking about. So, right, as far as Singer goes, we never get past the first page for Hardin because he doesn't think that deaths that result from famine are a bad thing. And notice, this is still not going to apply to Singer's argument because what we are viewing as a surplus is beyond what we need to save for emergencies. That's Singer's whole point, is that, look, we are purchasing stuff and treating ourselves to excess. Okay, it is fine if you need to save for retirement and have an emergency fund, a little nest egg put aside for, if your car breaks down or whatever. But, anything beyond that, that is what the surplus is. So we're not being punished for, saving or being frugal with our resources at all. We've still got everything that we need. This is surplus. And it might be kind of like hard to think of yourself in a situation where you might actually have surplus, but I hope we get there. I don't know. Things might be kind of bleak, but I think you guys will do well and get nice paying jobs, and hopefully this is an issue you'll have to genuinely consider. Definitely not my job to tell you what to do. The Steelman version of this argument is a lot cleaner, right? And at the very least, like it doesn't quite talk past Singer anymore. And there's something to be said for the idea that, like, look, I am, I have a right to the things that I have earned, and I should not be obligated to give them up. It's a fine sentiment to kind of wrestle with. But I'll leave that to you guys and for our online discussion. And I guess I'll see you in the next module.